Welcome everybody to our live Q&A with Cold War Special Forces veteran James Stejskal. You can ask questions via the live chat, which should show to the right of your screen if you are logged into YouTube. James featured in our extremely popular Berlin Special Forces episode. That's episode 120 if you've not listened to it. Highly recommended. James served for 23 years with US Special Forces, including 2 tours in Berlin. Special Forces Berlin, or Detachment A, as it was called, was a small detachment of 100 highly trained soldiers who, should hostilities have broken out during the Cold War, were to wreak havoc behind Warsaw Pact lines. James has written 2 books, Special Forces Berlin, a history of his unit from 1956 to 1990, and recently a novel based on his experiences called A Question of Time. I highly recommend both books, and I'm sure listeners or viewers tonight will have some questions about those. I can see we've got a good number of people who have joined. So, James, welcome to our Cold War Conversations live stream.
Thanks, Ian. Happy to be here. Good to see you again. Glad to see that everyone on that side, well, most everyone is healthy and carrying on.
Yeah, no, indeed. Now, we already have some questions, so I'm just going to read this one. Marcin, who is our very diligent moderator on Facebook, he's got a question. He's seen a photo on detachmenta.org with a description saying operation where we broke into Soviet military liaison mission to prove that their security with armed guards was ludicrous. Do you have any details of that, James?
That was about 1976, 1977. Yes, it actually happened. They were actually sort of given a dare by the Berlin commander to see if they could do it. And it was a small team, I think 5 people total, managed to get in and obviously took pictures inside the building and then got out without being caught. So that was, just one of many fun things that happened in the city.
So go on, tell us a few other fun things that happened in the city, James. Don't leave us on tenterhooks.
Oh, you're taxing my memory now. I could tell you about the captain that took the wrong S-Bahn and ended up in East Berlin in civilian clothes, but unfortunately he was fully armed at the time because we were on an exercise, and ended up in being chased down by the East Berlin police, and luckily made it into West Berlin without having to shoot anybody. But, he probably would still be in Lubyanka if they had caught him.
Wow. I didn't read that in the book, James. You've obviously, there's another volume there, I reckon.
Well, that's kind of why I wrote the novel, is because some things will probably never make it through the censors.
Right. We've got some other questions, I think. We have a good number of people on, so I'm just looking through. There's lots of highs and... right. There's a question from Mikko Vajalainen. Excuse Mikko if I've got that completely wrong. What countermeasures did you have against Stasi or Soviet surveillance when you would have been operating in GDR territory?
I think that just goes back to standard tradecraft. One of the first things you do is you learn how to surveil someone. And once you've accomplished that task, once you've mastered it, then you learn to look for counter surveillance. And it's basically using the tactics that you learn to avoid being followed. It also depends on what you're doing too, because a lot of things you see in the movies are not quite accurate. People turning around and looking, going down to tie their shoelaces, staring in a reflection of glass. And basically what you're doing is you're telling the people that follow you that you're looking for them. So the idea is not to show them that you're looking for them. And what you're trying to do is achieve that minimal bit of space where you can do your operational act without them seeing it. And that's what's key. So a counter surveillance route might be 2 hours long. It might be 5 hours long. It might be 2 days long. It just depends on what you're doing. So it's a lot of practice and a lot of hard work, obviously. A lot of boredom too.
Yeah, no, indeed. Let me just check for some other questions here. A question from Bob Sturdivant asking about how many people were assigned to Detachment A during all of its years.
Well, as you said, it was a small unit from about 1956 to 1984. There was a total of about 100 people in the unit at any one time. And then after that, the unit strength increased to about 120. But I have a roster of almost everybody. And so far, it's about 850 people that served in it from the beginning, either in 1956 all the way to the end of 1990. A number of people like me served multiple tours, so obviously you've got some overlap there, but not very many altogether.
Right. Thank you for that. A question from Craig Smith. Did James get close to being caught or found himself in a tricky situation that he considers himself lucky to have got out of?
I can think of several. A number of them are in my civilian life. But in Berlin, actually one of the most interesting near misses was with the West Berlin police and the British Army. We had basically a car chase through the northern part of the city, being chased down by Berlin police, and then the British MPs jumped in and decided they were going to chase us. It would not have ended terribly badly. I wouldn't have ended up in a communist prison or anything, but we managed to escape that. The only other time was very nearly getting shot by an East German guard while on a reconnaissance of the wall when apparently the East German got a little bit nervous and fired a couple of rounds over our heads, thinking that we were either escaping into East Germany or trying to escape out of it. But those were two of the most notable incidents.
Right.
Trying to make sure that we weren't doing anything wrong.
Right.
I'm not sure if he was just a bad shot or just really trying to shoot over his heads.
Yeah. I guess in Berlin, there's a danger that the West Berlin police are going to think you're Red Army faction or something like that in plain clothes.
That was an issue. Also, IRA. When you were in the British sector, you had to be really careful that you did not throw up that profile. Some of our brethren from the 22nd SAS came into town once in a while, and we ran into them either in meetings or training and things like that. And they would mention the same thing. They were always on the alert for IRA, and they fully expected an IRA attack in Berlin, but luckily it never happened.
Yeah. Numerous attacks in West Germany, but none in Berlin. We've got some other questions. Yoko Sombati, I think that's pronounced, and people will know listening to the podcast, my pronunciation is never that strong. His question was, how the PT standards and selection for Detachment A were like during your time there? Did you have to do a Q course / assessment selection?
Everyone that was in the unit on the operational teams was already Special Forces qualified. So that meant you had to go through the assessment and selection course, go through the qualification course for Special Forces, which did change over the years somewhat. To get into Berlin meant that you obviously had to be qualified. You had to be up to standard on the quote unquote Army physical fitness standards. You had to have also your language qualification, which was a big hurdle for a lot of Americans because foreign language is not taught extensively in the United States. Excuse me. So all those factors played into whether or not you were selected. Obviously, they would look at your record and decide whether or not you were suitable to work in the assignment, to work in a city, being closed in with all the Berliners. Quite a few people got to the unit, decided it was not enough field time for them. They preferred being out in the forests and the woods. A lot of people did not like the idea of actually being in civilian clothes and undercover. They were uncomfortable with that. And they either were asked to leave or they volunteered to leave. The standards for staying in the unit were pretty hard too. And we had what was called I won't use his name, but the Commander's Express, which was very simply that if you got in trouble, the commander would say, you're out of the unit, and within 24 hours, you would be on the duty train out to West Germany. If you were lucky, you might get to go back to a Special Forces unit. If you were unlucky, you would end up in the 8th Infantry Division.
I take it the 8th Infantry Division wasn't a very popular division to be in then?
Especially post-Vietnam, it was not nice. It was not a nice place to be.
Okay, we've got some other questions. Tim Cockett from the Manchester Military History Society wants to know, did you observe any escapes from East Germany or any incidents on the border?
I'm trying to think, going back a few years. I saw the results of not the incident at the time, but in a couple of cases, we were able to observe what had happened, to see the site of the incident and try to figure out what went on. The few escapes that happened were so far between each other. Yeah, if you were on the wall and happened to see one, then you were extremely lucky. In that regard.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Dirk R wants to know, what were the rules of engagement in the Eastern sector if they actually caught you?
Didn't really have any rules of engagement. If you were caught, you were caught. That was it. We couldn't carry weapons when in the Eastern sector. So if you were caught by the Germans, the East Germans, basically you were on your own.
Right. But obviously in time of war, then
in time of war, yeah, that would have been a whole different story. But again, the idea was not to get caught. about 20,000 Allied troops in Berlin. About 100 of us were Special Forces, and surrounding us were about 1 million East German and Russian soldiers. So the odds were not that good for wartime.
Yeah. We spoke about that on the podcast, didn't we? That the life expectancy wasn't going to be great for you. Carsten Schulte wants to know, can you tell us anything about your cooperation with the BND, the West German intelligence services? I know you were doing counterterrorism work with GSG-9. Presumably there would have been some BND involvement in that.
Well, actually, the GSG-9 interaction was training. The GSG-9 could not operate in Berlin because it was a federal force. Same thing with the BND. They could not operate in Berlin. So what the Berliners, what the West German government had was what was called the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. And they operated in West Berlin. We did not interface with them at all. The only people that did was the Central Intelligence Agency, primarily because there were some trust issues on both sides. The CIA did not trust everyone that worked for either the BND or the Constitution Office. And they felt the same thing about us. As it turned out, there were quite a few East German plants within the West German intelligence service.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
We did, however, have some interface with the Berlin police. The Berlin police had its own counterterrorism unit, and starting about 1977, we actually did training with them. Taught them how to use helicopters for repelling, exchange tactics on close quarter battle, room entry techniques, things like that, hard skills.
Right. On a similar theme, Graham Third wants to know, how closely did you work with UK Special Forces?
In Berlin, not much. We would occasionally run into them in the British sector. They looked like us, long hair, leather jackets, and they would always be carrying their Browning high powers. We had more interaction with some of the other special forces units, the 10th group down in Bad Tolz, which was completely separate from us. So, like I said, in Berlin, not much at all.
Yeah. It was interesting when I spoke to you on the podcast about the, I think it was called the Red Sail exercises, where you were sent over to the UK to act like an IRA active service unit to test out British security.
That's true, and in those operations, we worked heavily with MI5 and MI6, and they would often bring in, especially when we were down near Portsmouth, they would bring in people from the Special Boat Service to act against us, essentially.
Right. You talked about some, the interactions with the British. Did you have much interaction with the French?
No, not at all. They did not have any kind of special purpose troops within the city, and we really saw no benefit to getting close to them. So there was, I think the most interaction we had was when we were working in the French sector, just trying to avoid them.
I remember the story you tell of them when the wall opens and you're scanning people coming through the checkpoints to see where there's anybody of intelligence value, and the French have a slightly different approach.
Indeed, they did. They were more interested in the young women than anything.
Mark Vegas wants to know, what was a typical day like in Special Forces Berlin?
Oh, I don't think there were typical days. You could go from a typical training day might involve doing surveillance training or actual surveillance on a target. We worked occasionally with the American intelligence services in the city, and they would ask for assistance, and we would supply them people to help them keep up on a target. We would also, especially after 77, 75, actually, when we started picking up the counterterrorism operation, we would spend a lot of time on practicing close quarter battle, a lot of shooting, working, building entry techniques, things like that. So it went back and forth from the soft skill tradecraft, going out and picking out locations for dead drops or actually practicing them, doing city exercises where we might disappear into the city for 2 weeks at a time and practice both non-technical communications like dead drops, but also practicing high frequency radio transmissions from inside a hotel or inside of a building, very much like what happened with the OSS and SOE during World War II. And then the hard skills, of course, the weapons training and things like that. Like I said, the counterterrorism operations or mission picked up more and more after about 1977. Just thought of something else. We would also work at Tegel Airport with Pan Am Airlines. The airline manager for the city realized fairly early on that skyjacking was a problem and actually invited the Berlin Brigade to help them out. And the unit was, of course, the designated counterterrorism unit. So we actually worked with Pan Am on the flight line at Tegel International Airport. So if you came into Tegel anytime between 1977 and 1990, there's a possibility that some of the people that were handling your baggage on the ground were actually from the Special Forces Berlin.
I love that. I love that story. You must have had a legend or a false identity when you were plainclothes in West Berlin. What was your legend? What job were you supposed to have, or what was your name?
Well, Detachment A, which was an innocuous name that was supposed to make people die of boredom. But initially, there was no really good established cover statement, and that was a problem, which led to the unit being reorganized in 1984 and actually disappearing and coming back under another guise. So before that, it was basically, we support the mission of the Berlin Brigade, and beyond that, you were not supposed to talk. If you were in your military guys, sometimes you were in civilian guys, and you might be doing something like, well, I'm coaching a basketball team, I'm going to school at the Free University. Later on, the unit had a military police cover, and our job there was to provide security assessments and vulnerability surveys of American embassies and weapons sites around the world. So that was an established cover. And that actually worked pretty good.
Right. But if you were civilian, you were doing your training in the city and you were picked up by the West German police for whatever reason, you didn't have a false ID. You just identified yourselves as US military personnel.
In West Berlin, yes.
Yeah. Okay. We do have some other questions. Carlston Schulter wants to know, did you encounter any GDR spy forces in your time in Berlin?
We used to encounter interesting things happening in the city all the time. And so it was always, you wondered who they were. A couple of times we did actually pick up people and have them picked up by the Berlin police. one time a guy was out in front of our office compound, which was mixed in with a bunch of other military units and logistical things. And he was taking pictures of the front entrance, and one of our people noticed it, called in the German police, and it turned out he was a Russian who had a diplomatic ID card, but obviously he was trying to take pictures of military installations. I witnessed several times things happening, and one occasion we were on an exercise, and I was observing a meeting going on in a sort of a store mall. A number of small cafes and things like that. It was open air, but there was a place where I could sit above everybody and watch our meeting going on. And while I was in this meeting, I noticed a guy out in the middle of the grounds who had a briefcase in front of him, and he kept turning it minutely every couple of seconds. And finally it got to the point where I could see the front of the briefcase, and I had a telephoto lens on my camera, and I took a picture of it. There was an actual lens inside of his briefcase. So he was taking photos of a different meeting going on while our meeting was going on. Took pictures of him and what I thought was going on in front of him, turned it all over to the military intelligence people. Never heard a word back on them, but they said, "Thank you very much." Who knows? Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. It does underline that. And I think I mentioned this in the podcast, that, the name for Berlin was City of Spies. And certainly when you hear stories like that, it really underlines that. Alexander Vatter wants to know, did the unit focus on undercover and urban warfare, or were you still training for classic special forces missions like direct action and guerrilla training?
The easiest answer to that is yes. We did both. The plan was, in the initial stages of conflict, was to go to ground in the city, and that would require urban operations. Two of our teams would remain in the city and operate civilian clothes out of safe houses, places we had established. We had equipment, caches around the city that we could rely on. And then after a suitable period of time, which was not very long, 4 teams would cross out into East German territory to do their mission. And that was sort of the delineating factor when you would go back into classic special forces operations. So behind the lines operations for sabotage, basically our mission was to recognize where the Russians were, or the East Germans, tell our commanders back in West Germany where they were moving and how they were going, try to slow them down as much as possible. And so you were doing that either in the city or out in the forest.
Okay. No, thanks for that. Some other questions. One from Yoko Sombati again. Did you have people of Hungarian descent in the unit? And also, second question, did you have a favorite piece of Warsaw Pact military equipment that you used or studied?
We did not have anyone of Hungarian extraction I know of. Over the years, that's possible. We had quite a few others. We had Poles, we had Czechs, we had Germans, all who had come to the United States and become U.S. citizens. You had to be a U.S. citizen because that was the only way to get a top secret clearance. So we had quite a few interesting people. At one point, we did have a Hungarian pilot in another one of my special forces unit. He was a pilot who had defected with his airplane and then joined the U.S. military. As far as favorite Soviet equipment, I was kind of fond. I think my favorite toy was the Stejskal automatic pistol. which had a suppressor on it, and it was fun to play with, but not that I would ever want to carry it operationally.
Right. Why wouldn't you want to carry it operationally?
Reliability factors.
Okay. Oh, okay.
I mean, we had to train with Soviet gear just to know how to use it and how to operate it. One point we trained on armor so that we knew how to start up and move a T-55 or a T-54. Luckily, I was too big. I couldn't fit into them. I was too tall. So I knew I would never be given that mission. So.
Yeah. Such great stories. Such great stories. I wondered how long it would be before somebody talked about atomic demolition munitions, and we talked about this in the podcast. I think they were called trash can nukes because of the size of them. I don't think you actually trained with them, but you cover some of the history of that in Special Forces Berlin book, don't you?
I did, because early on, the guys in Berlin were some of the few people that had full top secret clearances. To be in the other Special Forces units, you had to have at least a secret. But Berlin was one of the few units that was required to have a top secret clearance. So when the atomic demolition program, the small nukes program started back in like 1956, they had a team from Berlin actually participate in some of the testing of how they were going to deploy them. And so there's a picture in the book, Special Forces Berlin, of the team that had just completed an exercise. They were contemplated for use in Berlin, but there's no place to keep them reliably. And if there was a war, you did not want to have 6 or 12 very small nuclear weapons fall into the hands of the bad guys. So it was decided that those weapons would never be deployed to Berlin.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about it in the other episode, and you cover it in the book that some of these nuclear weapons were supposed to be attached to the leg of a parachutist.
Well, initially the weapon came in 3 pieces. It was a modified atomic device, and it weighed about 350 pounds total when it was all assembled. So that required 3 different people to jump with this equipment, and then it was assembled on the ground. The later units, which came into service in the very early 60s, were a single unit, and they only weighed about 65 pounds. So they were not that big. They stood probably about 18 inches tall and about 12 inches in diameter. They weighed about 65 pounds, as I said, and they could be fairly easily jumped. Nobody that did it liked it, but yeah, that's the way it was. So at the time, it would have been an interesting job to put one of those in place.
Yeah, I think interesting is probably an understatement there, James. Yeah. But
everyone always questioned whether or not the actual timers worked. They said, "Okay, you set it to the delay time, and then you move out." And the guys would always say, "Are you sure this is going?"
Yeah. Wow. Another question from Carsten. He's in the book you mentioned the British well rod pistol, but Carsten wants to know: did you have any other James Bond Q type gadgets that you can tell us about?
Well, most of the James Bond Q gadgets we had were stuff left over from World War II. I mean, from very simple things like the caltrops, which are the diamond-shaped spikes that you can throw out of your car, and the following car will run over them and lose all their tires. We had things like explosive coal, pieces of coal that would actually explode if they were used in a fire. But those went out when we found out that the East Germans were using crushed coal, which made sure that those things would not work. Explosive flour that you could actually bake into a cake. Those are some of the weird things. But we also had a lot of small, interesting weapons. One called the Stinger, which was a single shot 22, which was about this big, and you could hold up against a target and fire it. The well rod, of course, which is a very famous weapon. The high standard 22, another interesting weapon, which was good for more than one shot. The one thing I liked the well rod because it was extremely quiet. But the problem was it had a very long cycle time, and you could only fire one round at a time and then have to recock it. So that could be a problem if you were being attacked by more than one person.
Yeah. Well, your aim wasn't good, but I'm sure everybody in the unit's aim was absolutely top notch. Impeccable. There you go. A question from Gillian Cox. What was Detachment A's relationship with the CIA?
Mostly like the rest of the military, bad. They were kind of hands-offish. They didn't trust us for some strange reason. But the military did not have a real good relationship with the agency in the 60s or 70s. Their traditional case officers were very wary of getting involved with the military. So we would occasionally interface with their office in Berlin, but they did not want to get too close to us. Now, that being said, we had quite a bit of training by the CIA. They would send over training teams, and that's where we picked up most of our training on intelligence tradecraft or from these training teams. And they were mostly made up of retired CIA officers who turned into instructors. And it was good, valuable training. In fact, Bill Casey came over, the former director of CIA, came over one year, and just to see how things were going, and he observed his people training us. So,
right, because you also talked about your involvement in the Iran hostage crisis, and obviously there would have been CIA involvement in that.
CIA support, there is still a lot of discussion about whether or not the agency could have done more for that operation. The one successful part of the operation was actually the infiltration into Tehran of some advanced force people, two of whom were from Berlin, maybe three if you look at my next book. So they were helpful there, but they were not so helpful of being able to provide information as to what was happening within Tehran. And nobody is really sure if they were holding back on information to protect sources or whether or not their sources had really been wiped out, as they said. So that's still a question that's up in the air.
Yeah. One of the things that I was interested to read in your book, and you sort of have this as well in your novel, A Question of Time, as well, is wearing enemy uniform in order to disguise yourself when you're East Germany, which is a direct contravention of probably the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention. But I guess, your role was really without rules. You did what you needed to do to get the job done.
Well, our view on this was if you were captured in civilian clothes, if you were captured in a U.S. Army uniform, or if you were captured in an East German or Soviet uniform, basically it was game up. Nobody expected that they would keep anybody around. The Soviets and East Germans did not act too kindly towards what they would consider spies. Yeah.
The a quick question around the nuclear weapons, which always interests people. Mark Vegas is asking, what was the blast range of the small nuclear weapons? How was it? It was a very low kilotonnage, I imagine.
Yeah, interestingly enough, that's one of the few things that got redacted out of my book. Let's put it this way. If you were within roughly 1,500 meters to 2,000 meter circle of that device when it went off, it would be a very bad day.
Right. Right. Okay. Hopefully that's answered your question there, Mark. More questions around the weapons you were using. Alexander Vatt is asking, did you have any Beretta 71 or MP5s in the inventory?
Berettas, we did get some Berettas, the 9mm Beretta, towards roughly 1985. We adopted old German weapons before that, a Walther MPK submachine gun, the Walther P38 or P1, which was the World War II era weapon. We switched to the Walther P5 later on when the Walther P38 started to explode. We found out that the requirements of close quarter battle, which meant you were putting a lot of rounds down range, was very hard on a weapon with an alloy frame, and they tended to disintegrate after about 5,000 rounds. And the MP5, the Heckler Koch, we acquired about 1984 because it was the cool weapon at the time. I'm not sure it was much better than the Walther MPK. It was much more sensitive. The MP5 is a very complex, comparatively, weapon. And if it would get dirty, it was very prone to jamming, misfires. Whereas the MPK, you could throw it in a mud puddle and pick it up and use it right straight away without a problem. More reliable.
Yeah. And that seems to be your watch, is you obviously need something that's going to work under extreme circumstances and, being thrown in a puddle versus something that's a little bit more fragile. We've got some questions coming in quite thick and fast. Did you have any missions covering the Soviet mobile missile launcher threat like the SS-20?
The mission of the unit, as I said, was to try to locate the Russians, try to slow their movement down. One of the ancillary missions of the unit was to try to diminish the Russian mobile rocket threat. And this is where the 50 caliber sniper rifle came into being, because it is not a sniper rifle for people. It was originally designed as an anti-materiel rifle. And if you fire a sniper rifle from 2 miles off and punch a hole in a Russian rocket with a 50 caliber round, you basically ruined the missile. They won't be able to use it. So that was envisioned for a wartime deployment, was to carry those on. And if you ran into a Russian mobile rocket detachment, was to try to stand off and fire rounds to their missiles.
Right. Okay. Well, hopefully that has answered. I'm trying to remember who asked that question. We've got them coming through thick and fast now. A slightly different question. Were you married? And if so, how amused was your spouse with your job?
Let's put it this way. My wife today is different from my wife then. Not the same person. Quite luckily, actually, but not amused would be the way to put it. It was being in the military is hard enough on a relationship. Being in special forces is one step further down the road. You're absent a lot. You have to work nights a lot. You have to keep things away from your family. So it's not the ideal place or not the ideal thing for a relationship. You have to have a really strong marriage to survive it. So I was not so lucky, or I was lucky, in whichever way you want to look at it.
Yeah. So did you tell your family you were in Special Forces, or did they think you were just in the army?
No, they knew I was in Special Forces.
Right.
And the families that were in Berlin were instructed not to talk about it. So they did their best, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Another question from Miko. If you were going on ops in the GDR, did your unit have any assets in place? People providing intel or safe houses?
This would fall into the category of our bad relationship with the CIA. The CIA had the primacy for all intelligence operations in the Eastern Bloc, and they ran all the assets in East Germany or the Czech Republic or the Soviet Union. They would not, in any circumstance, share any of that. Any of those people with us. Ostensibly, in time of war, they were going to turn them over. But I think as events later proved out, they did not have many assets that would have been usable for us.
Yeah, probably would have made you more vulnerable with potential Stasi infiltration or anything like that.
Since about 80% of them were.
Yeah. Question from Matthew Comstock. If the balloon had gone up, was there any part of your mission that you would have been extremely reluctant to carry out? I never said these were going to be easy questions, James.
In retrospect, at the time, no. Everybody was, primed and ready to go. The Russian army, the Soviet army, and the Warsaw Pact were our number one prime, as Milt Bearden called it, the main enemy. So it was very much a us or them thing. So I think, I don't think anybody had any question of whether or not they would be able to execute the mission. We had reservations about our survivability rate, but that was a different question altogether.
Right. How were you supposed to cross the wall and get into the GDR? Because presumably that if the Warsaw Pact had invaded, there would have been holes in it. But had you picked specific locations where you knew how you were going to infiltrate into the GDR?
This goes back to a typical day in Berlin. We would spend quite a bit of time looking at the wall from every angle that we could get at. We had great intelligence provided to us by our aerial reconnaissance assets. We obviously could get down and look at the wall very easily on the West Berlin side. And we had occasion to look at it on the other side too. So we would choose locations that we could get through and not end up directly in a East German military barracks or something like that, which there were quite a few of. But each team would pick out its own location and practice methods for getting either through or over or under the wall. And that included underwater techniques too, because Berlin had so many canals and rivers. There were a number of places that you could cross the wall underwater.
Right. Thank you for that. Carsten's got a question. Was Berlin an open carry city at the time, or weren't you armed while in civilian clothes?
I'm just trying to think what the limits are on the statute of limitations are on on weapons charges. If we were on a military operation, the commander had the option of saying go out armed or not. In some cases we would be, some cases we would not be. On a daily basis, almost everybody in the unit carried their own personal weapons with them. And I don't think we had any real bad incidents, with the exception of that captain that got caught on the other side of the wall, almost got caught. Anyway, so it varied. Sometimes you would, sometimes you wouldn't. I had my own personal weapons that I would often carry. And then when we were on operations, we would either have our issue weapons or none at all.
Okay. And just looking down the list for further questions, you mentioned that the post-Vietnam regular army was rather dysfunctional. Can you elaborate on what those issues were?
This is a result, I think, of the Vietnam War. There were a lot of people that objected to it. The draft ended in 1973. The Army was starting its new volunteer army, and there were issues of discipline. There were issues of drug use. A lot of racial incidents between blacks and whites, between Northerners and cowboys, Southerners and blacks. It was just sort of an era when the leadership could not get a real good handle on how to discipline the units, and to keep up the volunteer army thing, they had to basically say, we're not going to punish people too much for what they're doing. So there was sort of a laissez-faire attitude with the leadership, and then along with the drug problems and the crime problems within the units, the regular army had some severe issues. That, of course, has since about I'd say about 1980, changed quite a bit. So now it's a much more professional outfit.
Yeah. A question from a name in that I can't, difficult to read out. But anyway, how difficult was the Army Special Forces pipeline in that time? What were PST standards, as well as what type of games did the cadre make you play during your pipeline?
This is, the pipeline varied from the beginning in 1952 all the way until today. So you would have different levels of difficulties. The Barry Sadler Green Beret song says 100 men will test today and 300 will pass. Essentially, that's not the words, but my particular class, I started out with 110 and we graduated 13. So it was dependent on the time and the people, obviously. What kind of games did they play? I wouldn't call them games. Basically gave you the opportunity to fail or give up. They would take you out on runs, and if you decided you didn't want to run, then basically you were saying, I don't want this. So that would be the determining factor. Now, obviously, some people showed themselves to be not quite suitable for working in small groups or working together. Obviously, working on a team is very difficult. Working on a small team in close quarters for a long period of time is even more difficult. So they wanted to weed those kind of people out. They just put you through things that people either had the mental desire to get through or they didn't. And physically, yeah, some people did not have it physically, but I don't think there was anything that a normal person could not get through if they wanted to.
Right. And presumably there were things like mock interrogations and that sort of stuff going on.
Mock interrogations, what they called SEER school, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school, always included a interrogation session. Some of those could be kind of rough. Being locked in a box that seemed to be about 2 sizes too small, in a very hot room for a long period of time. Physically, sometimes they would be abusive, yeah, but not to the point where they would cause injury, but make you decide whether or not you wanted to continue this or not. Some of it was pretty realistic. There was one incident where we had a guy who had come from Africa and was an American citizen, was in the army, and he wanted to be in special forces, but he had some history, had been arrested in his own home country and spent several days in the control of the secret police. And he got into the interrogation phase of a SEER class. And after about an hour, he said, "That's it, I can't do this." And so he just knew what his limitations were.
Right. Got a question from Bob Sturdivant. Have you ever been able to go back to Berlin now that the wall is down? And have you gone to the places that you were actually planning to target?
I've been back to Berlin several times. I've actually not been back there since before 2000. And I'm not sure I like it so much now because it's wide open and nice and beautiful. There are no military and no walls to hold you in. It was a different era, and there was a feeling of being in this small fishbowl that some of us actually kind of enjoyed. And oddly enough, I think I was probably one of them. But going back to the city now is like going to a completely different location. So I've been back to some of the locations, back to the barracks that we were in, the locations where we were at, seen some of the targets and things, but now it's, it's a railway bridge. How interesting. It's not a tourist kind of thing I really want to go see, but
it's the sort of thing that the listeners of Cold War Conversations find absolutely fascinating, James. And I really appreciate your time tonight. What I am going to do is just show people your books. James's novel is A Question of Time. It's a really good read. It is based on his experiences. It's a Detachment A mission into East Germany. And he's using a number of the techniques that he used in his training. He probably won't tell us which ones, so you're going to have to buy the book and try and guess what is real and what is fiction in there. The other book that James has written is Special Forces Berlin. This is his account of Detachment A from the 1950s through to 1990. It's a really good read, some great photos in there as well. But I recommend both books, and also listen to episode 120 of Cold War Conversations. James, before we finish, I did want to thank you very much for your service. The stories you tell are incredible, and I can't imagine ever being put in some of those situations or being ordered to do those sort of things. And I always feel humbled when I speak to people like you, and I'm sure the listeners agree. And we just really appreciate hearing your stories.
I thank you for that, Ian. But actually, really, it was for me. It was an honor to serve, and really an opportunity that I will never have again. And I enjoyed every minute of it. So, like I said, or like you said, I wanted to add that the Special Forces Berlin is the nonfiction version, whereas the A Question of Time is the fiction version. It's going to go on. It's part of a series which I have called the Snake Eater Chronicles. And that's just the first one. The second one will be coming out through Casemate this summer. And there's probably going to be 2 or 3 more. Some of it's fiction, some of it's not fiction, but it's all based in fact.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to the next installment of the Snake Eater. I was going to say Snake Eater Chronicles. But James, thank you very much for that, and thank you very much for everybody who joined the live stream. I hope you enjoyed that, and keep listening to Cold War Conversations, and stay subscribed to our YouTube channel as well, because we will be having further live Cold War conversations coming up. So have a good evening or have a good day wherever you are. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. And thanks to everybody that dropped in.